This is Hardeep Bryce from FeedSci, and welcome to your weekly update. This week we wanted to dive in a little bit to the numbers that were published by UK Finance recently, looking at fraud as a whole in the UK. So the first thing that's absolutely staggering about the figures that have been published is the fact that £1.3 billion was lost in 2021. Now, when you break that down, you start to see even more interesting trends in there. So for example, if you look at authorized push payment, over £580 million were stolen by fraudsters, which is up by nearly 40%. There's 195,000 cases. So investment scams have gone up over 57%, and they now account for £170 million worth of loss. More and more people started to invest over the pandemic, mainly because there was a number of different stock markets and shares that was really struggling to come out of the pandemic. And then we saw huge gains in things like tech stocks, massive price fluctuations in cryptocurrency. All of these have allowed fraudsters a target audience. So whilst the number is huge, actually in the context of the world that we've lived in for the last 2 or 3 years, you can kind of see why fraudsters have moved to that means. But then actually you look at social engineering or impersonation scams, and they're still rife. There was over 50% growth. I think they accounted for about £215 million worth of loss. While the fraudsters are jumping on the bandwagons for things like investment scams, they're still duping customers. They're still playing on their fear and their vulnerability. So those things haven't gone away. And then actually the other one that for me was really interesting was CEO fraud. Teams were remote. A number of organizations had to change the way they work. As a result, you can see how fraudsters have potentially used this to drive nearly 165% increase in that loss line. If I'm sending in an invoice and claiming that it needs to be paid urgently by the CEO, historically, those finance departments and the CEO may have been sat in the same office. And through the pandemic, they weren't. And a lot of companies then haven't gone back to the office. They are still remote. And you can kind of start to see that play out in these numbers. And I think that shows why, as banks and actually as individuals, it's really important that we continue to protect customers and continue to protect ourselves. If you kind of look outside of that, though, it's not just about the numbers, it's not just about the cases. Actually, there's some historic myths that have been busted, I think, in this latest report. We often think of victims of scams, especially impersonation and things like this, as being elderly. But actually, there's some really interesting research that shows that the typical victim was under the age of 35. APP and scams in general is a industry-wide thing, is a nationwide thing, and that's why it really needs to be fought at that holistic level. So if you think of the news right now, it's all about scams, it's all about APP. But actually, if you look at the card fraud numbers, £500 million was lost in 2021. The problem hasn't gone away. There were over 2 million cases. It's important not just to fight APP, but also to keep that focus on card fraud as well. And things like SCA will hopefully help that in the coming years. One final really interesting insight for me, the loss figures were broadly consistent in internet banking, but there was 30% more cases. Loads of new technology has been brought in to fight account takeover in the last 5, 6, 7 years. So we are slowly starting to drive down the amount that fraudsters can drag out from each individual customer. But I think the numbers are really interesting. I'd encourage everyone to have a read of them. What it shows is why the fight against fraud is really, really key. Not just for an individual bank, not just for solution providers like FeedSci, but for society as a whole. 1.3 billion is a huge number. The millions of people affected is absolutely horrendous. I think it's really important now more than ever to collaborate to try and drive the change and try and protect consumers. Thank you very much for listening. This has been Hardeep Bryce from FeedSci.